Hi guys, welcome back. This is Unit 1, Lesson 4, Making Sense of Analysis. So essentially what we're going to be doing in this lesson is taking what we've learned about analysis since we started Unit 1 in terms of picking out details and analyzing those details and being able to write about those details in complex sentences, and we're going to take those analytical complex sentences and talk about how we turn them into analytical paragraphs. So we're not just taking a detail and writing about it, but in this case, we're combining several details and several sentences and turning them into a paragraph that maybe has a little bit more meaning behind it than just our single sentences that we've worked on in the past. This, of course, is a culmination of previous lessons, and if you need to go back and review previous lessons, we'll be talking both about bread and about lamb to the slaughter in this particular lesson. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about an analytical paragraph's essential elements. So what do I mean by having an analytical paragraph? What goes into it? There are essentially four parts, and I'm going to combine parts 2 and 3 as one, so you can think of it as a 3 to 4 part paragraph. The first part of an analytical paragraph is the paragraph's claim, sometimes called a topic sentence, depending on what you're doing. So if you're just exploring a topic, you'll call it a topic sentence. If you're trying to prove something, it's more of a claim. You're claiming that something is true. But essentially, the job of that sentence in the paragraph is to introduce what you will be talking about to the audience, whether you're going to be explaining or proving something. You're introducing what you will be doing. The second and third parts are the evidence and the elaboration of the paragraph. And this will be the biggest part of the paragraph. This is where you're going to use those skills with complex sentences that we worked on in previous lessons. What you need to remember is that more often than not, this needs to be repeated multiple times within the same paragraph. So if you have one claim, it's often going to take 2, 3, 4 pieces of evidence to actually prove your claim. So you'll go through the process of providing evidence and elaborating upon the evidence multiple times. Fortunately, for the things that we've done on past lessons, you've picked out multiple pieces of evidence and have written multiple sentences about them. So in this case, for this particular lesson, it may just be a matter of combining work that you've already done and turning it, putting them back to back in a logical way. The last thing that you do in an analytical paragraph then is that you provide a conclusion. And the conclusion is exactly what, you think it's wrapping things up, right? We know how things conclude. But what you want to do is you want to avoid just repeating yourself in a conclusion. Instead of repeating what you've already said, which is boring for the reader and boring for you, you want to make the rest of the paragraph, all the stuff that came before it, the claim, the multiple pieces of evidence and elaboration, you want to make that all important to the reader. So you want to make the reader feel like they got something meaningful out of the experience of having read your paragraph. So what you'll end up with is a pretty sizable paragraph. We're talking at minimum, if all of these elements are their own sentence, and you have one claim and one conclusion, there's two sentences. Let's imagine that we have 3 pieces of evidence, and each of those pieces of evidence has its own sentence of elaboration. We're talking at minimum 8 sentences for those 3 pieces of evidence. Now, does that mean that every time it's gonna work out that perfectly? No, but average, you'll probably end up with approximately that many sentences in a well-done analytical paragraph. So let's take a look at 2 examples. We'll take a look at this first example, which would be perfectly acceptable and adequate if you were to turn this in. It's about the story Bread, which we read earlier, and hopefully you should have notes and work on that story from before. So you can see I've color-coded the paragraph so that you can see the different parts, and obviously they're coming right in order. So we've got our first sentence, the claim sentence. In the story Bread by Margaret Atwood, she makes the bread change values through different settings, and that gives it a deeper meaning. So that's what I'm proving, right? The bread is changing values. The changing values of the bread gives the story a deeper meaning. So then I'll go on and provide my multiple sentences of evidence and elaboration. I say this. First, she makes the bread seem meaningless by saying a heel of rye you got last week now going moldy. Here in the kitchen, there is so much bread that it can rot away before you have time to finish it, so it doesn't mean much. Then the bread becomes more valuable, like during the famine and in the prison, when it uh, when it can save lives, such as in this quote from paragraph 4, 30 or 40 or 100 of your friends, your comrades, will be caught and will die if you give them up so that you can have some bread. So when we come back to the kitchen, we magically realize how vital bread is to life, because the bread becomes magical and you are in awe of how valuable the bread is, such as when it says, "But can you trust it? Can you eat it? Can you eat it?" Paragraph 7, because now you would never waste it in the way that you would have at the beginning of the story. So that's my evidence and elaboration. Now you can kind of see if you read it, it's not maybe as thorough as it needs to be, but it does have the evidence, it does have the elaboration, it does have some analysis, it provides multiple pieces of evidence that all tie together to help prove the claim of the bread changing in value and becoming more and more valuable as the settings change. So then I go on to my conclusion, in which I say, knowing all of this, we should always remember to recognize the value of normal things like bread. So instead of repeating myself, what I do is kind of say, hey, look, there's normal things in our lives, but maybe we should take another look at them and recognize what kind of value that they have. So hopefully my reader gets a sense that, oh yes, there was some meaning behind this, behind me reading, these pieces of evidence from this story. Now, this paragraph would be perfectly fine if you turned it into me. There are things that need to be expanded. It sounds a little clunky. There are probably some areas that could use some sprucing up, but essentially it does the job adequately of what I'm asking you to do. But if you're looking to do something a little bit more creative, a little bit more thoroughly, then you might write something like this. Margaret Atwood's story Bread turns bread, a food that most of us take for granted, and transforms it into a valuable, life-giving object in order to emphasize to readers a lesson about taking nothing for granted. So there's lots to prove in that sentence, right? Like I have to prove that the bread um, in the story transforms into something valuable and life-giving, and that is teaching this bigger lesson about not taking things for granted, which makes my job in conclusion harder because I don't want to repeat that over again. So then I'll move on to my evidence and elaboration, where I say, when she first shows us bread in paragraph 1, it holds very little value. A heel of rye you got last week now going moldy because there is such an abundance of bread that hasn't all been eaten in time. Which is actually a mistake. If you notice it now, I've included an incomplete sentence in there, and that's my own typo. So even this version of the paragraph has a problem with it that still needs to be fixed. But later, as the settings evolve to famine and prison, the bread is able to literally give and end life. When it is used as a bribe for information in the prison, taking the bread means that 30 or 40 or 100 of your friends, your comrades, will be caught and will die. Notice that the way that I incorporated that sentence, that piece of evidence, is it's almost like it's part of my own writing, and that's really what you want. But also notice that I failed to cite that that second piece of evidence. It doesn't have a paragraph number with it, which is another mistake that would need to be fixed. I go on to say, therefore, by the time the setting returns to the bread-rich kitchen, you notice the almost magical quality of the bread now floating above the table. It's so valuable that you regard it with awe. But can you trust it? Can you eat it? Paragraph 7. And again, I've worked in that piece of evidence so that it's almost like it's its own, like it's just part of my own writing, and it's kind of building upon my own ideas. I move on then to my conclusion, where I say, never again will you look at it the same way, making you wonder, what else have I undervalued in my life? Perhaps we should be more careful to acknowledge our privilege in the world. So I end with this like piece of advice that builds off of not taking things for granted. I take it one step further based on what I've proven from going through this journey with the bread. Now, hopefully you were able to follow that, and it's going to be your job now to do the same type of thing, but with a different story. So your job is to complete a paragraph for Lamb to the Slaughter that builds upon your previous work that you've already done for Lamb to the Slaughter. You'll have some time to do this, and when you come back to class, please be prepared to share your work and your thoughts. Good luck.